We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Beis Amid Beis and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 62b. On the previous Amud, Rav Safra had a rule that anytime you have a situation of interest, which in the non-Jewish courts it would be collected by the malva, so then in such a situation in our courts, the lova would get back that interest. And the Gemara says, well, we can find an exception to this rule. Let's say you have a situation where the malva, he takes a piece of property of the loves, it's like a mashkan, a collateral, but it's below nechyas, it's without deduction, meaning to say that he's going to take the payros, he'll take the produce from that property, and that's just going to be an add-on. Besides, for when he gets back the entire loan, he'll also get to keep that produce, and that's essentially like interest, and so that's an exception to the rule, because in that situation, the malva does collect that from the love. But in our courts, that's not returned, mi malva lelova, it's not returned from the lender to the borrower in such a situation, as Rashi explains. In our courts, it's not returned. The avak ribisu, that's not considered to be regular ribis kitsutza, that's considered to be avak ribis. It has a hint of ribis. Kevan dezimnin sheinos and peiros, because sometimes whatever the property is, it won't have that produce. Shakram and lokin, something can go wrong with the vineyards. Ein zu ribis kitsutza, that's not considered to be like a set ribis, and so therefore again this seems to be an exception to the rule. And the Gemara says, Amarle said to him, Inu b'toras zivini asuli adayu. In that case also, the reason why that's an exception is because they're having that, they're considering that to be like a purchase. Rashi says, Inu nami ki afki le savri de v'toras zivini asu hanach peres liyadi de lokech. They understand that it's as though the fruits, the produce came to the hands of the buyer as a sale. Dechoz man shelo paralo ma'osav, because you have a situation here again where the lender is giving money to the borrower and the lender is then taking the property. That's kind of like a sale. It's almost like the lender is a buyer, because as long as he has not paid back the money, hakerem mocherlo, it's essentially like the vineyard is sold to him until whatever time that he's able to redeem it, whatever deadline they set. Now they could have just asked from a regular case of avak ribis, like the case of increasing produce in our Mishnah, but that also they could have said that they consider that to be like a sale. So in any case, that's an exception to the rule for that reason. And so the Gemara continues, this rule of Rav Safra of Kol Sheilu B'Dinein, and exactly what is he teaching us? We've given certain exceptions, and we say that's not included in the rule. So what is included in the rule? And the Gemara says, and here's what Rav Safra is coming to teach us. Kol Sheilu B'Dinein Motzian Milova L'Malva, any case where in their courts we would collect from the borrower to the lender, B'Dineinu Machzir, and so then in our courts we would return it, Mimalva L'Lova, from the lender to the borrower, Umaynu B'Ribis Ketzutza. What's that referring to? That's referring to Ribis Ketzutza. That's a regular case of fixed interest, as we said, Uchid Rebbe Lazar, following the opinion of Rebbe Lazar. Again, according to Rebbe Lazar, Ribis Ketzutza is returned to the borrower. And what about the other side of what Rav Safra said? Rav Safra said, Kol she'ilu b'dineim ein motziin b'dineinu ein machzir, and if in their courts we don't take it from the lova to the malva, then in our courts we don't return it to the lova. That's talking about Ribis Mukdemes, Ribis Mucheres. That's talking about interest essentially before the loan or interest after the loan. What that means to say is you have a loan and you don't set it up initially for interest. You don't say that I'm going to lend you, let's say, $100 and you're going to pay me back $150. Rather, you, in the case of Ribis Mukdemes, the person essentially advances the interest. He basically pays the money ahead of time in order to induce the lender to give him a loan, to lend him a certain amount of money, but it wasn't set up that way as part of the loan. And same with Ribis Mucheres, it wasn't part of the loan, but after the borrower, when he pays back the loan, he then throws in a little bit extra. That's Ribis Mucheres. So in those situations, that's going to be in their courts, Ein Motzian. We're not going to force that. We're not going to take that from the borrower to the lender in the non-Jewish courts, and therefore that's also not going to be returned to the borrower in our courts. And Rashi explains, in what case, what is the situation where in their courts the lender is not able to take it through the non-Jewish court system, and then we won't return it in our courts, we won't return it to the borrower. That's Ribis Mukdemes, Ribis Mucheres, B'shili Masnisin, Katanila, that's learned later on, V'habetoras Ribis Yoivle. In this case, he's giving it to the person, meaning the borrower is giving it to the lender as interest. Uvidineim, however, in their courts, Imlo Nasan, let's say he doesn't give it, Ein Motzian, so you're not going to take it away. The court's not going to force him to give it, Sharelo Pasakimo, because that wasn't part of the condition of the loan. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Keitzad Hauso, Lakach Heimenu Chitim B'dinar Zav Hakor. This is talking about the case of Dirabon and Ribis. Let's say he buys wheat from him, and he buys it at the price of 1 golden dinar per core. which is 25 silver dinar per kor, v'chein hashar, and that's the market price, v'chulu, and then what happened is the wheat went up in value, and he wants to collect his wheat, which of course now is worth more. He says, I want to take the wheat that I bought because I want to use that to get wine, and he says, well, instead, let me owe you wine at that value, and then the Mishnah said if he doesn't have wine, then it's going to be a problem of dirabanan ribis. And so the Gemara asks, V'chi ein lo yayin may have it, but if he doesn't have wine, what difference does that make? And Rashi explains, V'chi ein lo yayin may have achar sheyotza ashar liyayin. If there's already a market price for wine, V'hu chayiv lo hachitan o hamos. Now he's chayiv him either to give him the wheat, or he has to give him the money, the value of what the wheat is. Hareu keposek imo achshav al yayin. It's as if he's actually making a deal right now on the wine, and there is a market price for that wine. What's wrong with doing that? V'atanya, but we learned in a braysa in posken al aperos sheyotza ashar. We said that you're not allowed to set up a set price for produce until the market price is actually publicized. But yotza ashar, but once the market price is publicized, posken, then you are allowed to set up a sale in that fashion. Afal pisha ein lazeh yesh lazeh, because even though this person doesn't have, there is someone out there selling at that price, and you can get it from that person, and therefore it's not an issue. And Rashi explains in posken al aperos litein lo mos bekor chitin, meaning you're going to say, I'm going to give you a certain amount of money for a specific amount of wheat. V'lomar lo, he says to him, Teneyu li l'sof zman gadol, you're going to give it to me after a long time, meaning you're setting up the price now, and then you're going to give me the wheat much later on, even though the value, the price might fluctuate. V'afilu yesha nosen oso achshav bekach betchilas hakotzir. Now, even though there are those that will give it now at that price at the beginning of the harvest, ein zashar at sheyotza shar mefursam. That's not really called a market price until it's a publicized market price. V'kavua b'shukei ha'ir bekach. It has to be set in the marketplaces of the city that this is the price. As long as you have a publicized market price, that is okay. Because even though the seller doesn't have the wheat, let's say right now, but but there's somebody else that has it at that price, he would be able to buy it in theory with the money he received right now. He could go get the wheat right now, and so therefore, even though he's going to give the wheat later on, there might be a fluctuation in price by the time he gives the wheat. But since the wheat is available at the price they set right now, that's not considered to be ribis. And so the same thing should be true over here. Let's say he's converting this loan and saying, I'm going to give you wine instead of wheat. If there is a publicized market price, there should be no problem with that. Why does the Mishnah say that's problematic? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabba says, Masnisin b'balocha b'demeyan askinan. In our Mishnah, we're talking about a case where he's obligating himself with their value. And Rashi explains, Masnisin b'balocha b'demeyan askinan. In our Mishnah, he's obligating himself with their value, meaning to say, Shalo nasan lo zeh hamocher lelokeach demei hachitin shechayiv lo. The seller never gave the buyer the value of the wheat that he's obligated. In other words, the case over here was the buyer gave a certain amount of money for wheat, and so now the seller is obligated to give that wheat, but he never gives him that value or that wheat that he's obligated. Sheyachzor v'yekavlim heimenu b'shvil hayayin. He never gave it to the lokeach and then took it back from the lokeach for the wine. Essentially, it never went back and forth. Rather, he wants to say that the value of the wheat that I owe you, let's just turn that into a debt. And then we'll convert that debt into an obligation to give you a certain amount of wine at a certain price. He says to him as follows, I'm going to accept upon myself your wheat because I owe you wheat, and we'll say that right now that wheat is valued at 30 dinar. In theory, if I would give you the wheat that I owe you, you'd be able to sell it for 30 dinar. So let's value it at 30 dinar. And then we'll say that I owe you 30 dinar, and we'll say that instead I'm going to give you wine according 30 dinar worth of wine, according to the market price of wine right now. That's how much wine I owe you. Now, if he actually had wine, so then from this moment, the buyer would essentially be the owner of that wine. Then it wouldn't be a problem. Let's say the wine goes up in price, because it would go up in price in already the reshus, in the possession of the lokeach. But let's say you have a situation over here where the seller doesn't actually have wine. And furthermore, here's why it's a problem. He hasn't received any money right now. Essentially what happened was he received received the money or the wheat much earlier, and he's converting that into a debt obligation. He's not actually receiving any money at this moment. Now, if he was receiving money at this moment, shenuch alomer, so then already we can say that he's getting money right now, yachalhu liknoso bedamim shakibel, then in theory he could buy the wine right now for the money that he received. But right now he hasn't received any money at this moment, so nimsa she'enam etzlo ela behalva bi'alma, so it comes out that it's only by him essentially as a loan. He's converting it into a sort of a kind of a debt, so he has no wine and he's receiving no money right now. That's why it's problematic. In our Mishnah, it's considered to be a ribis d'Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues, Uchidetanya, it's like we learned in the following Brisa, and Rashi explains the Tanya as we learned in the Brisa, Sheyesh Hefresh bein nos and mos, lavo ala bechovo, that there's a distinction between a case where the person is actually giving money at the moment at a certain market price, and a situation where the person is just in debt, and he's converting that debt into a sale at a certain market price. We see a distinction in the following Brisa. Harei shayanosha bechavero mana, let's say one person owes another person a mana, v'halach v'yamar al garno, and then he comes and he stands on his threshing floor. V'yomer, and he says, Tein li mosai, give me the money that you owe me. Shani rotza likach v'emchitim, because I want to use this money to buy wheat. So Amar lo, so he says to him, Chitim yeshli, Shani no sein lach, he says, I have wheat that I'm going to give to you. Tsei v'asei olai kashar shalachshav, we'll evaluate it according to the current market price. V'ani el loch kol shnei masar chodesh, and then I'm going to give it to you for 12 months. So in that case, usher, it is prohibited in that situation, even though again, in general, you usually are allowed to set up a sale in this fashion where you're going by today's market price, but that's only when the money is actually given. In this case, where there was no money actually given, but in this case he was owed a certain amount of money, and so therefore essentially this person owed money, and he said, instead, the money that I owe you, let's set it up according to this particular market price. That's usher. The lav ki soro haboli yado dami, because it's not like a case where the money actually came to his hand. And Rashi explains, Vani ela loch hachitim kol shnei masar chodesh, I'll give you wheat for a full 12 months of the year, afim yisalu d'mein, even though the wheat might go up in value, akabel olai ha'iloi ve'ennem loch bedamim halalu, again, there's a certain amount of money that I owe you, so you're not actually paying me any money right now, but there's a certain amount of money that I owe you, and we'll say that money that I owe you, I'm going to give you the wheat at the current market price throughout the year. That's a problem, because that's not like a case where the money came to his hands. It's not comparable to a case where the buyer actually gives the seller money at the time that they're setting up what the price is going to be, because then already you can say that if he received money, the seller received actual money in his hands, he could in theory use that money to go out to the market and buy it right now at that price, but you don't have that in this situation. So you see from this brisa that we do make such a distinction between a case where the money is given right now and the case where it's just a debt that is being converted at a certain market price. And the Gemara continues, Abaye said to Rabbo, Idaloki Saro Habaliyadu, if the case of our Mishnah is like a case where the money has not come into his hands, so Mayir Yainlo, what does the Mishnah have to deal with a situation where he doesn't have the wine? Afilu Yesh Lo Nami, even in a case where he does have the wine, it should be problematic. And Rashi explains, Afilu yesh lo yayin nami, even if he has the wine, it should be a problem. Dehai tana, because this brisa that you're quoting above, ba'omid al garno kamar, it's talking about a case where he's standing on his threshing floor. Diyesh lo chitin, where he has the wheat, va'afilu hachi aser, nevertheless it's prohibited. So again, it shouldn't make a difference if he doesn't have the wine or if he does have the wine. And so the Gemara continues, Elamar Abaye, rather Abaye says, Masnisin kedetani Rav Safra beribis devei Rabbi Chia. Our Mishnah is like Rav Safra taught in terms of ribis in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia. The Tani Rav Safra beribis devei Rabbi Chia, because Rav Safra taught with regards to ribis in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia, he taught as follows: Yesh devarim shem mutarim, there are things which are technically mutar, va'asurin mipnei haramas ribis, but it's also because of haramas ribis. It's like doing interest with a loophole. Ketzad, how so? Amar lo, let's say he says to him, halveini money, says to him, lend me a money. So the person who wants to borrow the money says, lend me 100 dinar. Amar le says to him, money ainli, he says, I don't have 100 dinar to lend you, but chitin b'money yeshli, but I do have wheat that is worth 100 dinar that I could lend to you. Shani nosin lach, I can give you that wheat. So nasan lo chitin b'money, so he gives him the wheat for a money, In other words, essentially he's lending him the wheat, and now the person owes him a money. But then what he does is the person who gives the wheat for a money, he now buys the wheat back for 24 sela, essentially at a reduced price, because a money is 25 sela, and he's buying it back for 24 sela. So mutter, so that's going to be mutter. Essentially what happens in this situation is the person gives wheat, and now that person who he gave the wheat to owes a money, and then he buys the wheat back for a lower amount of money, and so now this person essentially has gotten the lesser amount of money, but he still owes a money. So it's kind of like a situation of ribbis. And so that's technically mutter. However, va'asr lasos kein mimnei haramas ribbis. It's still asr to do that because it's like haramas ribbis. It's like lending with interest but using a loophole. And so the Gemara says we can apply a similar logic to our case in the Mishnah as well. Hachanami over here also, kagon damar, the case could be where he says to him, halveini shloshim dinarim. He says, lend me 30 dinar. Amar Lei says to him, shloshim dinarim ainli. He says, I don't have 30 dinar to lend, but chitin b'shloshim dinarim yeshli. But what I could do is, I can give you wheat at 30 dinar. Essentially, he's selling the wheat for 30 dinar to the individual. Shani nosen lach, that I'll give you. I'm going to give you wheat at 30 dinar, and you'll owe me the 30 dinar. Nasan lo chitin b'shloshim dinarim. That's exactly what he does. He gives him the wheat for 30 dinar. V'chazar lekachem himenu b'dinar zav. And then he goes ahead and buys that very same wheat back from the person for a dinar zav. A dinar zav is, again, that's 25 dinar. It's 25 silver dinar. And so now you have a situation over here again where essentially he used this harama to lend him money because the person actually owes the 30 dinar. And now we say as follows. Now if the borrower has wine, that he's going to give him for the 30 dinar, meaning to say, now we're standing in a situation where he gave him the wheat for 30 dinar, he then bought the wheat back, and now the lova basically owes 30 dinar, he bought the wheat back for a cheaper rate, but that's essentially irrelevant to the obligation of 30 dinar. So now the lova owes 30 dinar, and the Mishnah is saying as follows. If this lova, if this borrower has wine that he's going to give for the 30 dinar that he owes, so pirahu de kashakal mine. So then essentially the person is taking produce from the love, veles lanba, and that's not really going to be a problem. That's what the Mishnah is saying. V'ilo, but if he does not, so kevan de les lechamra, since he has no wine, vaday mishkal zuze mine. If he's going to take from him money, meaning he's going to take the 30 dinar as money from the individual, that's already mechzik ribbis. That already looks like ribbis because essentially what happened over here, what basically happened over here was that he gave him 25 and then he took back 30. He did it through the mechanism of buying and selling. He did it through the mechanism of buying and selling the wheat, but that is still going to be problematic because it looks like ribbis. And Rashi explains, Kidetani Rav Safra, it's like Rav Safra said, V'lo b'posek imo b'tchil al achitim. The case is not where initially the buyer gives the money for the wheat at a certain price, and now the other individual, the seller, owes the wheat, and the wheat goes up in value. That's not what's happening. Rather, Shani knows, and look, it's essentially the other way around. The person is giving the wheat first. It's not the money that's going first. Keshar shalach shavun asanamlo. He says, I'm going to give you wheat at the current market price, and that's exactly what he does. He gives them the wheat at the current market price, and now the buyer owes the money for that wheat. And then then he goes ahead and he actually buys the wheat back, the wheat that he just sold him, he buys it back for a cheaper price. The ozel gabe sela, it's cheaper by 1 sela. Shahamona chafe slam, because Amon is 25 slam, he's buying it back for 24 slam. Voy adacha glamos, this person who had bought the wheat, which really he wanted a loan, he needed money, he was pressured to get money. He can't wait to the day of the marketplace, so that's why he did it. So essentially, by using this transaction of the wheat, he basically lent him 24 for 25. So mutter, that's going to be mutter, sharelo helelo demei hachitim yoser midemeyen, because he didn't actually, it wasn't more than the value. The actual sale of the wheat was for the market value. Beschar hamtonas hamos, he didn't raise the value because of the fact that he gave him a loan. V'hayu dozel gabe, essentially what just happened was that he lowered the price when he sold it back to the individual. So that is technically going to be mutter, but again, it looks to be like ribbis. And so then we apply that to our Mishnah as well. The chazar lekachan mimenu b'dinar zav. The case in our Mishnah also is a similar idea. He goes ahead and he buys it for a dinar zav, meaning to say masnisin kiko amar lokach himenu chitim. When it says in the Mishnah that he bought from him wheat, b'malvakoy, that's actually going on the lender. What essentially happened was that he bought the wheat back from him for a cheaper rate. Now when he's coming now to claim the money that's owed, because again, originally what happened was he gave him the wheat for 30 dinarim. Then he bought it from him for just 25. for just 25 dinarim, he bought back the wheat, but this person who he gave the wheat to initially for 30 dinar owes him 30 dinar. So now he's coming to claim his money. So Amar lo tein li mo'osei, says, I want you to give me my money. Shani lokech ben yain, I'm going to use that money to buy wine. Amar lo, he says to him, Harei mosecha asuya salai b'dmei shloshim dinarin yain. He says, I'm going to give you that for the value of 30 dinar of wine, meaning I'm going to owe you the wine at that market price. V'yain ein lo, and he doesn't have wine. So then that's a problem if he doesn't have wine, as the Gemara explains. V'i havelei chamer. Now, if he did have wine, so that wouldn't be a problem, because zuzah yoiv le meikara, because essentially he's giving him money at the outset, upiri shakal minei, and then at the end he's taking produce, he's taking wine, v'lo dami lo ribis. That already wouldn't look like ribis. Avol mishkei minei zuzeh, but to take actual money from him, aser, that already is aser, that's prohibited. The dinar zav yoiv le, because it really looks like a situation of a loan with ribis, because he gave him a dinar zav, which was 25 silver dinar, v'kashakal minei tlasin, and essentially he's taking 30, and that's why that would be problematic. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Rava, Rava said to him, Mihachi, if that's your interpretation of the Mishnah, it doesn't really fit with the wording of the Mishnah, because it says, for example, Tein li chita, it says, give me my wheat. It's not really the wheat that he's claiming, Demei chita mi boile, he's claiming from him the value of the wheat, because again, the case over here was that he initially sold him the wheat for 30 dinar, and so therefore he wants his 30 dinar, he wants the value of the wheat. And so the Gemara says, Tani, so he responded, fine, that's what it should teach in the Mishnah, Demei chita. It should say Demei chita, it doesn't really mean my wheat, it really means give me the value of the wheat. And then it said in the Mishnah, another problem that Rava has, Shani mochron, it says that I'm going to sell them, Shemechartim lochmi boile, it should be that I sold to you, you have to give me the value of the wheat, because I sold you the wheat for a certain amount of money. And so he responded, Tani shemechartim lach, so that's what it should say in the Mishnah, that I sold to you. And then the response is, Harechita chasuya salai b'shloshim dinarim. He says, I'm going to consider the wheat that it's worth 30 dinar. What do you mean I'm going to consider that it's worth 30 dinar? Meikaranami hachi ukminu elavi. That was the original deal. The original deal was he was selling the wheat for the 30 dinar. What do you mean I'm going to count it as 30 dinar? And so the Gemara says, well, hachi kamarle. This is what he's saying to him. B'dmei chitech shasi salai b'shloshim dinar, for the value of the wheat, which we said was going to be sold for 30 dinar, and that's why I owe you 30 dinar. Harei lachetzli b'hen yayin. He says, instead I'm going to give you wine for that. V'yayin ein lo, and he doesn't have wine. And so that's how we'll have to understand the Mishnah. But the Gemara still continues, V'ha b'dinar zav hakur v'chein hashar katani. But the language of the Mishnah is that it was a dinar zahav per core, which again was 25 silver dinar, and that's the market price. But that's not really true. That wasn't really the market price. Remember, he sold it back at a cheaper rate. That was the whole point. And Rashi over here explains, Habedinar zav akor v'chein ashar katani. V'im kidvarecha, so Rav is saying to Abai, if what you said is correct, kishalakachan bedinar zav, when he bought it back for a dinar zav, which is 25 silver dinar, haya hashar shloshim, it was really the market price would have been 30. V'hai da'ozel gabe, and he essentially sold it to him for cheaper. Di hashar bedinar zav, because if the case was that the market price actually was a dinar zav, v'zeh helim olav shloshim dinar meikara, and it was sold for above the market price for 30 at the beginning, so then already that would be a real problem of interest, because essentially what he was saying was, since there's a delay in you owing me the money, therefore you're going to have to pay me more money. That actually would be ribis. That was not really the case, so that doesn't fit with Abaya's explanation. And so the Gemara continues, Elama Rava, rather Rava says, Kishachivna Reb Oshia, he says, when I die, Reb Oshia nafik levasi, Reb Oshia is going to come out to greet me. Rashi says, Kishachivna Reb Oshia nafik levasi, Kisha Amos, when I'm going to die, Reb Oshia yotzel likrasi, Reb Oshia is going to come out to greet me, because I'm going to answer along the lines of Reb Oshia, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Gimel Amud Aleph.